My name is Michael Ann Busey, and I'm a board member of Arise for Social Justice, and also a member of the New England Central America Network. That's two of the organizations that you have to thank for putting this together, but also here at Springfield College, the Newman community, the Office Ministries, and New Horizons in Haiti. Some people said that we couldn't draw a crowd or fill a hall in Springfield for Noam Chomsky, that there wouldn't be enough people interested in coming. I know that most of you are here for one reason only, and that's to hear Mr. Chomsky give his analysis of power and what's happening in our community. And of course, that's a big reason we're here, but we have a number of other reasons for hosting this event in Springfield also. One of them is because this is a fundraiser, and you will hear more about that as the evening goes on. But really, the main reason that we wanted to have this event in Springfield is because we want a chance to keep building on the sense of community and the sense of movement that we feel here in Springfield and in Western Mass. We want a chance to start developing a really good analysis of what it will take to have social and economic justice in this country. And we want to build unity here because we are part of a movement, even though we may not always realize that. I'm struck that most of us in creative writing classes have been told that when we're writing a paper, we need to get rid of the passive voice. So we're used to speaking about the movement. We have to remember that you don't have a movement without moving, without going someplace. And that's what we're doing. But sometimes we don't realize it. We can get very myopic. We can get very short-sighted. We can think, well, we're working on our issue. We're working for our constituency. And we don't always see how the different parts of the movement connect each other. For you people who are science fiction fans, sometimes it's almost as if we're each in our own little dimension. We're really standing right side by side with each other, and we're separated only by the smallest moment of time or awareness to realize that we are connected with each other. But sometimes we do break through, and we get that sense of feeling. For me, I think one of the times recently when I've really felt that we were part of the same movement was during the Gulf War. And I saw Springfield and Western Mass, in fact, come together and organize in a way that I haven't seen around many other issues. Student groups, African American groups, social justice groups like Arise, low-income groups, you name it, and we knew that what was happening in the Gulf affected us. And we really understood when the war was going on what it was all about. Unfortunately, when the war changed focus, and I won't say ended, but when the war changed focus, we lost our focus. When the war switched to an economic front instead of a very obvious body count that we could see on the media every day, well, it seemed as if we weren't needed anymore, if the desire for unity sort of dissipated. And yet we still have an embargo in Iraq, against Iraq, that's causing devastating loss of life for people in Iraq. We have our own veterans who are crying out for media attention as they try to deal with the Gulf War syndrome. But because the battle is on an economic front, it doesn't seem as real to us. And the same thing happened in Central America. When the troops pulled out and it became an economic war instead, it was harder to see. And the same thing is happening here in this country, but we tend not to notice it. And yet we have to trust our ability to accomplish this task of unity and being in the same movement. And I do believe that we can do that. For many years, when I struggled to be a part of the movement for social justice, primarily within the peace movement and the anti-nuclear movement. But I never really felt like I was building an analysis that worked toward unity. And it wasn't actually until I started meeting and organizing with my own peers and started coming from my own experience as a low-income person, as a woman, and as a single mother, and working with other people like myself, that analysis started to come. And one of the first things we did was learn to ask the question, who benefits from our oppression? And once we started getting some answers to that question, then we could ask the next question, who are our allies in the movement? Who do we have social justice and economic justice in common with? Who do we need to work with and come together with? And this really came full circle for me when I had a chance to go to Nicaragua in 1993, and I remember being very moved by the depth of the commitment and struggle of the Nicaraguan people, and I said to one of the organizers there, what can we possibly do in the US to make a difference in Nicaragua? And what I was told was, you go home and you work for social and economic justice in your own country, you turn up the heat, you demand social and economic justice, and by doing that, you will help us here in Nicaragua to achieve the same. So our job is to build those connections and to do it at home. That was a really full circle feeling for me. If we're going to build a movement and really see ourselves as part of a movement, you who are here tonight need to be connected to everything that was happening when you walked in these doors. The different community groups, the organizations like Cafe Habitat, which is providing organic coffee and at the same time a livelihood for homeless people. American Friends Service Committee. If I start naming all of them, I'm bound to leave someone out, so I won't do that. But it's very important for you to go out and be connected with those groups. Otherwise, it'll be a little bit like going to a wedding for the food and forgetting to share the sense of community and commitment to community that we would ordinarily bring to that event. Now, I don't want to berate people too much, because when I look around this room, I see a tremendous number of tireless social justice activists, people from our community who've worked very hard together. All I want to say is that history is on our side, but only if we do the right thing. And the right thing is happening here as much as anywhere else that it might happen. So I thank you for coming. I'm going to turn this over to Jay Frankel. And don't forget, don't leave without signing a petition for freedom for Leonard Peltier, signing a letter to get Mumia Abu-Jamal a new trial, and making every possible connection that you can make, because we're the movement, we're where it's at right here. Thanks.
I think there's some room in this aisle over here, if they'd like to sit there.
Would you like to?
Sure.
Because they usually like the
Fire.
Yeah.
Sure. We'd also like to invite people to sit up on the stage if they'd like. They can come up on the stairway over here.
There's more room up here.
Are there still more people in the hallway now? Just push those out of the way, that's all right. Just so you can even sit there if you like. Oh, please, Barb, go ahead. Not in my chair. That's my chair. Kale, why don't you have a seat right there? Okay. Good evening. I'm Jay Frankel, a senior at Springfield College and a pre-law student. I'm delighted to be part of tonight's lecture program and also delighted to have been chosen as the student who is to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Why am I delighted? A person like our guest speaker, Dr. Noam Chomsky, is one who has the intelligence, knowledge, and the ability to articulate in such a way to influence us all, for those who are open to his vision and perspective in life. He challenges the college student and the academic alike in his or her future views on man and society. Dr. Chomsky is a man who has helped shape my views, and I hope that this part of my education will make a difference in my future law school studies. The Newman community of Springfield College, the Office of Campus Ministry, Arise for Social Justice, and the New England Central American Network proudly present Noam Chomsky this evening. Professor Chomsky will be speaking on the topic, Bringing the Third World Home. This topic has been very close to the heart of Dr. Chomsky. His lecturing and teaching for the past several years have been designed as one of challenge, intellect, and hospitality. He is identified by most people who have heard him speak and all who have read his work as one of the most inclusive people in our culture. Dr. Noam Chomsky has a very distinguished position on the staff at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology as a full professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics. MIT is neither the beginning nor the end of Dr. Chomsky's life or work. He has a great passion for transforming the world in which we live in. He is a tremendous advocate of truth, justice, and honesty. He settles for nothing less than integrity of word and spirit. Dr. Chomsky did not arrive here tonight at Springfield College without a fantastic amount of preparation. Two people have done an exceptional amount of work to bring him here: our Reverend Dr. Leo James Hoare of the Office of Campus Ministry at Springfield College, and Logan Patrick from Arise for Social Justice and the New England Central American Network. We thank Father Leo Hoare and Logan Patrick for their generous energy, time, and commitment to social justice. Noam Chomsky was born on December 7, 1928 in Philadelphia. His undergraduate and graduate years were spent at the University of Pennsylvania, where he received his PhD in linguistics in 1955. During the years of 1951 to 1955, Noam Chomsky was a junior fellow of the Harvard University Society of Fellows. While a junior fellow, he completed his doctoral dissertation entitled Transformation Analysis. The major theoretical viewpoints of the dissertation appeared in the monograph Syntactic Structure, which was published in 1957. This formed part of a more extensive work entitled The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory, circulated in Mimeograph in 1955 and later published in 1975. Professor Chomsky joined the staff at MIT in 1955 and was then appointed full professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics, now called the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy. Between 1966 and 1976, he held the Ferrari P. Ward Professorship of Modern Languages and Linguistics. In 1976, he was appointed Institute Professor. During the years of 1958 and 1959, Dr. Chomsky was in residence at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. In the spring of 1969, he delivered the John Locke Lecture at Oxford. In January of 1970, he delivered the Bertrand Russell Memorial Lecture at Cambridge University. In '72, the Nehru Memorial Lecture in New Delhi, and in 1977, the Huizenga Lecture in Leiden, amongst many others. Professor Chomsky has received honorary doctorate degrees from the University of London, University of Chicago, Loyola University of Chicago, Swarthmore College, Delhi College, Bard College, University of Massachusetts, University of Pennsylvania, Georgetown University, Amherst College, and Cambridge College. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Science. In addition, he's a member of many other professional and learned societies in the United States and abroad. He is also the recipient of the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the American Psychological Association. Dr. Chomsky has written and lectured widely on linguistics, philosophy, intellectual history, contemporary issues, international affairs, and United States foreign policy. His political works include At War with Asia, For Reasons of State, The Political Economy of Human Rights, Volumes 1 and 2, Rules and Representations, Radical Priorities, The Culture of Terrorism, Necessary Consent, and The Powers and Prospects, amongst many others. Noam Chomsky is obviously a very prominent linguist and political activist. His impact on the field of linguistics has been profound and lasting, changing the focus from a concern with methods of classification to a search for explanatory principles. The appearance of his syntactic structures initiated a fundamental shift in the emphasis away from the limited perspectives of empiricism, which he donated to American linguistics and social science, to an investigation into language and universal grammar as a uniquely human mental faculty with its own biologically determined structure and principle. As a social critic and political activist, Dr. Chomsky, a libertarian socialist, is acknowledged to be an articulate and persuasive critic of United States foreign policy. A fundamental aspect of his critique is the crucial role that U.S. academics and journalists play in their manufacturing consent. His writings in this area include books on the Vietnam War, called American Power and the New Mandarins, on the Middle East, called Mobilizing Democracy, The Changing Role in the Middle East, and on terrorism, entitled The Culture of Terrorism. Again, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Noam Chomsky to Springfield College as guests of all of us. Please welcome Dr. Noam Chomsky.
If my voice sounds a little hoarse, it's because I've been talking to a magazine called The Optimist, which is sort of appropriate since although what I say may have a rather gloomy sound to it, it's really intended to be optimistic, and I hope that that strain underneath doesn't get suppressed by description of the facts as they look to me, which is could be taken to be gloomy. The basic features of contemporary society, I think, are captured pretty well and clearly expressed, clearly well understood within the business world. For example, in a recent issue of Barron's Journal, which discusses what it calls, plausibly, capital's clear subjection of labor for the past 15 years. Now, the basic reasons for capital's subjection of labor globally, they're also pretty well understood. The one crucial factor was the breakdown of the dismantling, really, of the post-war Bretton Woods economic system by Richard Nixon back in the early 70s. That meant breaking down, eliminating the system of regulated currencies that had held since the Second World War. And that was a major factor in a huge explosion of unregulated speculative capital, unregulated financial capital. The scale it was accelerated by technological developments, which made it very easy to move speculative capital very fast from one place to another and in complicated ways. All of this has turned into an extremely efficient weapon against social policies that are designed to stimulate economies or to use public funds for public interests. And that was well understood by the mid-1970s. So in 1978, the presidential address at the American Economics Association by a well-known American Nobel Prize-winning economist, James Tobin, he discussed, even at those early stages, pointed out that this extraordinary explosion of financial capital was going, if left alone, was going to drive the world towards a low growth, low wage, high profit economy. And in fact, he proposed some mild reform measures which might have controlled that. It's called the Tobin tax, a slight tax on speculative transactions just to slow down this destructive, economically and socially destructive operation. It probably would work. It's been on the UN agenda and the agenda of a number of states since that time. It's never gotten anywhere because the people who run the world would prefer to have things work the way they are working. One can, of course, think of much more far-reaching changes than this one. It's commonly alleged that there's nothing much you can do. These are kind of forces of nature. The global economy is out of control, and so on. One just has to subject oneself to this kind of world. There's no evidence for any of that. This is mostly propaganda, and one shouldn't be trapped by it into impotence and inaction. The economy today is no more globalized than it was in the first decade of this century. If you measure globalization by foreign investment or trade or financial transactions or any other measure relative to global, to national, to actual product, which is of course the relevant measure. What's more, the international economy, the flows of trade and investment and so on, are very localized. They're overwhelmingly within three major areas: Western Europe, the United States, and Japan and their immediate surroundings. Those are all areas where political action, meaning action by populations through functioning governments, could well control the effects of the quite destructive effects of globalization. And it's precisely because public control is possible that there's a tremendous propaganda offensive to convince everyone that it's hopeless and you might as well just submit to it. And it's also for that reason that actual social policy during this period of capital clear subjugation of labor, actual social policy has been geared to two very clear objectives. One of them is to use the new weapons that are available to try to impose on the industrial societies themselves something like a kind of a third world structure. That's what I mean by bringing the third world home. The third world structures are pretty standard. Any third world country you go to has more or less the same character. There's a small sector of extreme wealth and privilege, often phenomenal. It's often amazing to see. There's a large majority of the population who live in various degrees of something ranging from barely tolerable to suffering to total misery. And there's another sector of the population that is essentially superfluous for wealth creation, and they have to be eliminated or removed in some fashion, and there are various ways of doing it, either death squads or send them out into the slums, or into the countryside or up the hills or whatever. Our way of doing it is different. We're a more civilized society, so we throw them into jail at a rate that is unheard of in any society in the world. In fact, the only country that's even close to us is China at the moment. We're way beyond any industrial society. The rate's going way up, increasing even faster. It went more than triple during the 1980s. is going up even faster now, and it's completely unrelated to crime. This is a way of dealing with the superfluous population instead of kind of what they call social cleansing in parts of Central America where you send out the death squads. It's one aspect of the bringing the third world home. Well, that's one part of social policy. The other parallel track, and this is worldwide, is to try to do something to undermine the threat of democracy, which makes sense because functioning democracy could significantly modify not only social policy but the institutions on which it rests. So therefore the threat of democracy, as always, has to be countered. Various ways to do this. In third world countries, you often do it by military coups, brutal terrorist military coups, of which the United States has initiated and supported plenty over the years for this reason. In countries like ours, the way to do it is to transfer power more and more away from from institutions which could be influenced by the public, as say the federal government could be, to transfer power away from them to unaccountable private tyrannies. That's what corporations are. They're pure tyrannical organizations of a kind that would be called totalitarian in the political realm. And they're basically unaccountable except for weak regulatory systems which are being dismantled. So if decision-making can be transferred over into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies, the threat of democracy is very much weakened. And that's another strand of social policy, dramatically obvious in the United States and England, and in fact the other countries influenced by them, like New Zealand and Australia, and to some extent to a lesser but noticeable extent elsewhere in the industrial world, as a result of the globalization, which is not out of control but uncontrolled, which is something quite different, and a difference that should be borne in mind. Well, going back to that article in Barron's, which is one of the main business journals, it warns that the glory days may be coming to an end. It refers to what it calls the aggressive campaign of labor in the United States to secure a so-called living wage, and the sudden grassroots push for a guaranteed bigger piece of the pie, and the occasional electoral successes that this has already met, and there are even bigger threats to which I'll come back. Well, so maybe these wonderful days of capital's clear subjugation of labor and bringing the third world home and destroying democracy, maybe that's not going to look so good a couple up down the road. That's something to worry about. I'm now talking from within the business community, from other perspectives, something to applaud. Well, let me say that the most important thing to bear in mind, I think, and the one message I'd really like to leave for you to think about, is that we've been through this over and over again before. I don't mean you and me. I mean modern history has been through it over and over before. That's very much worth remembering when you think about what lies ahead and what we can do about it. And let me just mention a couple of the major moments in which this has been true. The most important one, the classic one, was in the early part of the 19th century, early Industrial Revolution, when the what are now called neoliberal ideas, the ideas of classical economics, the intellectual tools that are being used to justify and structure the policies that I've been talking about, when these tools were forged. That's when David Ricardo and others created the basis for the modern science of economics, which, according to Ricardo, was established with the certainty of the principle of Newton's principles of gravitation, and which demonstrated some fundamental truths. One fundamental truth that it demonstrated was that solicitude for poor people is misplaced. You only harm the poor by trying to help them. So therefore, you've got to stop this. You've got to stop this and treat people with what's nowadays called tough love, meaning kick them in the face, because that's what's really good for them, as the science of economics demonstrates. If you do anything else, you're really harming them. And those of you who've been through proper courses understand how you spell this out and prove the theorems and so on. The other point that had to be made was sort of a mixture of a moral one and a scientific one, and that is that to try to demonstrate to people the elementary truth that they have no rights. In pre-capitalist societies, people had a place, like in a feudal society. Everyone had some kind of place. So like an organic structure of some kind. The place might be, let's say, a rotten place, but you had some place and you had a right to live in that place, and the system was set up so you more or less maintain that. But the new science had demonstrated that people have no rights, certainly no right to live. They have only the rights that they can obtain in an unregulated labor market. And if you cannot survive on the basis of selling your labor power in a free labor market, then you have a couple of choices. One, you can die. Another, you can go to a workhouse prison. And a third, go somewhere else. That was the advice given by Malthus and Ricardo and others. Can't survive on the labor market, go somewhere else. Well, of course, this is like the 1820s. You could go somewhere else. This country, for example, was being cleared of the plague of a native population, and as they were removed, you could go here, and the same was true of Australia and so on. So you could go somewhere else. And in fact, the peak period of immigration to the United States relative to population was around 1850, as people were going somewhere else under the pressure of the policies that had taught them or was trying to ram down their throats that they had no rights. Well, that's by the 1830s, it looked as if these policies had in fact won in Britain. They had been established in law, and there was a sense among the rulers, you know, basically the business world, that they had reached the end of history. Everything was perfect. They had achieved something like perfection. Everything was now great. There was a little one fly in the ointment, however. That is that people are stupid. They cannot seem to understand the principles of the science and the consequences that follow from it, and they got this funny idea in their heads that if we have no right to live, as you claim, then you have no right to rule. And in fact, what got started was, for years, the British Army was involved in putting down riots and disruption. He then starts labor organizing, Chartism, the socialist movement, and so on, really threatening. Well, there was a reaction to that. Fortunately, the science is flexible, and it discovered that people do have a right to live. And you get a change, and you get the foundations of what later became a kind of social contract and, you know, the roots of what became welfare state capitalism in later years. Well, that was one moment, one of those moments when it looked as if the end of history had been achieved, everything was perfect, the rules of the science were established, but people somehow disrupted it and broke it down, and you moved to something else. Later in the century, it looked as if order had been restored. And once again, there was a good deal of euphoria about the establishment of right thinking with the consequences of the kind I've mentioned. But there were people who disagreed. One of the ones who disagreed was a very famous artist and designer, William Morris, who scandalized a public audience at Oxford in the 1880s by announcing that he was a socialist, and he went on to say that he understood that it was the received opinion that the current devil-take-the-hindmost society was perfection, and that finality had been reached in it and it would never change, and if that were true, he said, civilization will die. But he said, despite the fact that this opinion is held by the most learned men, he refuses to believe it. And he turned out to be right. Popular struggle continued. Finality and perfection hadn't been reached. 40 years later, the major figure in American labor history, Eugene Debs, was also right when he said, essentially reiterated Morris's words in another period of euphoria. Debs didn't happen to do it from a public forum. He did it from a jail cell where he had been sent by Woodrow Wilson because he didn't have the intelligence to perceive the magnificence of Wilson's idealistic wars. But again, Debs proved correct. The gay 90s in the United States just a century ago were such a period, a very brutal period in which it seemed that the capital subjugation of labor was total and there was no democratic threat and no threat of public organizing. Same was true of the Roaring 20s. That was a period when capital's clear subjugation of labor was celebrated, and the received opinion was that this is finality and perfection. It was achieved in what labor historian David Montgomery at Yale calls correctly a most undemocratic America. It was achieved by very brutal means, state violence and others. But again, it proved wrong. The 1930s, there was large-scale public activism and organizing and pressure, and finally the United States, which is the business-run society par excellence, was driven more or less into the mainstream of industrial society, was compelled to adopt social measures, the New Deal measures, which in fact had been achieved even in highly autocratic European societies long before. Well, again today, what we hear is that perfection and finality have been reached in the devil take the hindmost society, all the same stories that have been repeated for 170 years in a cyclic fashion, and there's no more reason to believe it now than there ever has been to believe it in the past. That, I think, is the major thing that we learn when you look at the history we now have since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Well, right now, May 1996 is quite a good moment to have a close look at these things, in particular at the state of American democracy, and to ask where we are and what we can do. We've just been through the primaries. We're now moving on to the presidential campaign. And it's kind of interesting to look at the primaries and see what was there and what was missing. It's an interesting distinction. There were things that were there in the primaries. One thing that was there aplenty was media coverage, huge publicity. Another thing that was there was money. In fact, more money there was only one nomination contested, remember, not two, like in 1992. Nevertheless, far more money was spent in these primaries than in the preceding ones, despite the fact that there was only one nomination contested. So that's what was there. Plenty of coverage, plenty of money, more than ever before. There were also some things missing. One thing that was missing, rather strikingly, was voters. Apart from the New Hampshire primary, where a stunning 25% of the electorate showed up, in the other 11 primaries in which Robert Dole won the candidacy, participation ranged from 3% to 11%, and he won with about 1 million votes over the whole country. That was noted in the press, which also noted, the political commentator of the New York Times, that such voting as did take place in New Hampshire and elsewhere was pretty apathetic. Voters didn't seem to care, and some of them showed up and made some moves. But in any event, whatever was going on, it didn't seem to interest the public very much. A second thing that was missing, is much of a difference between the two candidates who emerged from the process. They're both moderate Republicans, both basically sort of inside the Beltway government insiders, have been all their lives. Both representatives of the business community, not of the most fanatic type, but of the less fanatic type, so moderate Republicans. And that's been understood since from the beginning by people with real power and authority. So a couple of months after Clinton's election, the Wall Street Journal had a lead article kind of reviewing his performance. It was very upbeat. It concluded that it pointed out that Clinton had come down on the same side as corporate America on every major issue. Quoted top CEOs, executives of major corporations, were very happy about his performance, described it as better than an improvement over Reagan and Bush. The Wall Street Journal did find a few things that, actually one thing in this article that they thought wasn't perfect. There had been a government regulation about using of recycled paper or something like that, and they thought that was kind of overdoing it, a bit radical. But apart from that, he was just about perfect and an improvement over Reagan and Bush. A year later, the business community discovered in November 1994 that it could do a lot better. And by September 1995, Business Week, main business journal, described the Gingrich Congress as a milestone for business. It had never before have so many goodies been showered so enthusiastically on America's entrepreneurs. And given that kind of servility to private tyranny, the kind of service that Clinton could perform wasn't very impressive. And as a result, a lot of support, though by no means all of it, shifted over to the guys who were showering the goodies. When Ron Brown died in the plane accident a couple of weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal had a headline which said that Brown had worked tirelessly for U.S. industry but got little support from business in return, which is true. They could do even better. So even though he was a tireless advocate of the business community, that wasn't enough. By 1995, then, the political system had improved over 1993, and in 1996, business now has to choose between two leaders, one of whom consistently comes down on their side, and the other one the other end of the spectrum is total servility to corporate power. So that's the spectrum in 1996. The Business Week article reviewing this situation is headlined "Back to the Trenches," meaning they're showering goodies on America's entrepreneurs in an unparalleled fashion, but it's not enough. The feeding frenzy has to continue, so back to the trenches. And then comes kind of an interesting wish list, every element of which satisfies the two properties I mentioned before. It involves transfer of power to unaccountable private institutions, tyrannical institutions, to undermine the thread of democracy, or else they involve transfer of wealth to try to bring to the United States the structure of a third world society, in effect. Or they do both, as many do. So if you look at the measures proposed, I'll run through the major ones. The primary one is regressive fiscal policies. For example, elimination of tax on, or cutback of tax on financial gains, which are about half the income for the top 1% of the population, then dropping off very sharply. It's called tax cutting, but of course it's tax shift because it means somebody else picks up the burden. If the top 1% doesn't pay on half of their income, somebody else is paying. So it's a tax shift from the very rich to poorer sectors of the population. The point is not to stimulate investment. That can't be the reason. For several reasons. One is that the country is just awash in capital. There's a huge amount of capital around. Profits are going through the roof, putting even more money in the pockets of the same rich people isn't going to stimulate investment. What would stimulate investment is exactly the opposite, stimulating weak demand by putting more money in the pockets of poor people. But of course, that's the wrong move for social policy for obvious reasons. So point number one is tax shifting, regressive fiscal measures which impose more of the burden on those least able to pay and benefits the super wealthy. Well, the second major measure that's advocated is deregulation, which again is a kind of cost transfer. So for example, if you cut down regulation of, say, toxic waste disposal, that does increase the profits for industrial polluters, but there's a cost. The cost is immediate in increase in sewage and water rates, and longer term in health costs, and of course the unmeasurable costs transferred to future generations. But that's a regressive tax shift. That's a shift of costs from the very wealthy to the poor. So the same kind of measure. Has nothing to do with efficiency or anything like that. It's just shifting burdens. Tort reform is exactly the same, but for obvious reasons. The healthcare reforms, as they're called, incidentally, all of these things are called reforms, but whenever you hear the word reform, you should reach for your pocket and make sure your wallet is still there. Reform is a technical term which means a particular kind of change, the kind that's advocated by the powerful. So, for example, Mao's Great Leap Forward or Stalin's collectivization, they're not called reforms. They're changes, but they're not reforms. So reform is a propaganda term that means the kind of change that is advocated by the people who are in a position to articulate their demands. So turning on to health reforms, reforms should always be with quotes. Health reforms, again, are very substantially a cost transfer operation. There's a very respectable group called the National Leadership Coalition, headed by two ex-presidents, Ford and Carter, bipartisan coalition. They estimated recently that the current proposed reforms amount to a hidden tax, they called it, which they estimated at about $10 billion a year in decreased wages and increased premiums. Now, of course, this is a highly regressive tax. That is, it takes a far bigger bite from poor people than from rich people. And other aspects of the reform, they also estimated that the same reforms will increase the number of uninsured by an additional 8 million by the year 2002 over the 46 million already predicted as a result, as things increase, which again is a regressive cost shift, very regressive one. The same is true of the other measures like closing public hospitals or ensuring that medical decisions are not made by patients and doctors, but by pointy-headed bureaucrats and insurance offices who have to authorize things in advance, knowing nothing, layer and layer of bureaucracy, plenty of costs, but the costs are being paid by the poor and being transferred away from the rich, or even turns into income for them. So health reform is looked at economically as very largely a cost shift operation. And I think that's correct. Same is true of things like what are called cutback of subsidies for public services. So for example, New York, a city in the state, have cut what they call subsidies to mass transit. Subsidy is another funny term, kind of like reform. It's odd to use the term subsidy for the use of public funds for public interest. But anyhow, that's called a subsidy. So they cut back the subsidies to mass transit, which has the obvious effect, namely it increases subway fares and bus fares and so on. Well, you know who takes the subways and the buses. That's just a tax, and it's a regressive tax. Same is true of the cutback of funding subsidies, as they call it, for public education, say public colleges and so on. That just decreases the services, increases the costs for the people who use them, which is just another hidden tax. The same is true of a major program in fact, this is one of the driving elements of the whole program, which Clinton when Clinton said Clinton and the Republicans agree on it, it's devolution. That is removing of decision-making power from the federal to the state level. It's what Clinton's talking about when he says the era of big government is over. Well, what's the point of that? So like you take, say, block grants and give them to the states to administer instead of the federal government. What's the point of that? Well, it's called power to the people, but that's pure cynicism. It's just a measure for taking power away from people. The point is, the driving force behind it is that the state governments are, however the public may be involved in them, they're just even middle-sized business operations can compel state governments to do what they want. So for example, the same day that the New York Times ran a big op-ed on the philosophical difference between those who want power in the federal government and those who want power to the people by block grants to the states. The same day, the Wall Street Journal had a story headlined, What Fidelity Investments Wants, Fidelity Investments Gets. It described a threat by Fidelity, which is the biggest financial company in Massachusetts, a threat that unless the state of Massachusetts, meaning us, gave it even more, showered even more goodies on it, they would simply move across the border to Rhode Island, where they can sort of kick them in the face and tell them to do what they want. So of course the conservative governor of Massachusetts agreed, and now even more benefits are being given by taxpayers to Fidelity. Raytheon, the biggest manufacturer, did the same thing around the same time. And in fact, businesses of that scale, or even much smaller, have enough clout to get state governments to do what they want. It takes somebody like, say, GE or Microsoft to push the federal government around in the same way. And therefore, by moving decision-making and grants and so on down to the state level, you can be quite sure that by various measures, tax measures, others, the money will end up in the hands of the rich, not in the hands of the poor. It's harder to guarantee that when things happen at the federal level, and the same is true of every other decision. So devolution is just is a very natural thing to support if you want to make sure that actual decision-making power is not in the hands of people, but is in the hands of private tyranny. That's exactly the consequences it'll have, and so on across the board. Well, the Business Week message, back to the trenches, that goes out to the 23,000 corporate lobbyists in Washington. That's up from about 365 in the 1960s, before the big assault on the population began, the current assault. The number of corporate lawyers has increased about the same proportions. These are part of major programs since the early 1970s to overcome what was called the crisis of democracy, that is, the threat of democracy, which developed in the 1960s as usually apathetic and passive sectors of the population forgot their proper place and began to try to enter the public arena. That caused what was called a crisis of democracy, which has to be overcome by restoring them and making sure that power stays in the proper hands, as with another move towards perfection and finality. That same issue of Business Week had a small item in the back which said the following. It said, "Workers still taking it on the chin, with the share of national income devoted to wages hitting a post-war low." Well, that's another step towards perfection, along with the milestone for business showering goodies on America's entrepreneurs. This right now is a good time to have a look at that. April, as many of you may know, is the month where the business magazines do a review of the state of the economy in the preceding year, the state of the economy from the point of view of business. So Business Week has its annual Top 1,000 issue, talks about the top 1,000 corporations. Fortune has its Fortune 500 issue, reviewing the top 500 corporations. They just had them. And they were, for the last couple of years, they've been running out of adjectives to describe what's been happening. You know, dazzling and stunning and so on have already been used. About the only one left for this year was spectacular. Business Week describes its top 1,000. The headline is, "1995 was one for the books." The most valuable corporations increased in value by about 35%, fifth straight year of double-digit profit growth. Doing particularly well are the ones that are on the public dole, like aerospace, which the public funds, but it becomes private profit. Their profits are up 22%, with a 5% increase in sales and a 1% decline in employment, so that's really good. Another part of the economy that's just booming, some of the best corporations, are those that sell temporary workers, like Manpower Incorporated and Kelly. Their sales are going way up. That's good. That's part of creating what's called a flexible labor market that doesn't have such rigidities as knowing when you go to sleep at night you're going to have a job the next day, or benefits, or health care and that sort of stuff, which any good economist can explain to you, harms efficiency. So that's going way up. Real wages, meanwhile, are flat, probably a 40-year record. The Census Bureau just came out with its latest figures. They now run through 1994. That's the latest data. And the decline in median income from, say, 1989 to 1993 had already been estimated at about 7%, right through a recovery, which is why it was interesting, a big recovery. That stayed the same through 1994, so 89 to 94, 7% decline right through the recovery. And that just extends what's been happening through the 80s. The inequality has reached records. Both the Census Bureau and the RAND Corporation's recent studies showed it's long been unique in the industrial world. There's also unusually low social spending on social benefits, and that has led to the highest poverty rates by far in the industrial world. England's trying, but they're not quite up to us. The OECD, the Organization of the Rich Countries, just issued a report pointing out that the poorer sectors of the population are significantly worse off in the United States than in Europe, although it's a far richer country and with unparalleled advantages, again, apart from Britain, which is called the success story of Europe here for that reason, kind of a model that others should follow. Well, heading the list for the Business Week Top 1,000 is General Electric. It describes their phenomenal $32 billion rise in value last year, so they're right at the top of the list again. 38% of their profits come from financial services, and another 38% come from overseas. 38%, not another, come from overseas. General Electric, of course, it has always, in the last half century, been the beneficiary of very substantial public subsidies. It's one of the top military contractors, and it's doing just terrific. The smaller players are also doing pretty well. For example, if you go into the local Bank of Boston office, you can pick up a handout for customers, which describes their incredible achievements last year, record profits for yet another year, such enormous profits that they're becoming one of the biggest bank in Argentina, one of the biggest ones in the Southern Cone. And they quotes their chief economist as saying that the economy is in excellent shape, has low growth, high profits, and wages are, as he puts it, restrained, which is a kind of a nice way of saying that they're continuing the decline since this period of capital's clear subjugation of labor began back around late 70s, 1980. The latest Nobel Prize winner in economics, Robert Lucas, was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal a couple months ago, and he said, "We're doing great and have been for a long time. The economy is just terrific." That's not an entirely original comment. Other people have said the same thing. For example, General Medici, the neo-Nazi ruler of Brazil, during a period of an economic miracle when Brazil had achieved the status of what was called the Latin American darling of the business community in the business press, thanks to ample use of terror and torture and so on. He pointed out that the economy is doing fine, but the people aren't. Well, a little more honest than Lucas, but the same point. So the United States is also on its way to becoming an economic miracle like Brazil and Mexico and others like it, even Haiti, which was going to become the Taiwan of the Caribbean a few years ago, if you remember that far back. Well, let's turn to another aspect of the current scene, namely attitudes. This is a very heavily polled society. We know a lot about public attitudes. And they're interesting. Over 80% of the population now believe that the government isn't even functioning. That is, or to the way the question is asked, that the government works for the few and the special interests, not for the people. That's a question that's asked every year on the Gallup poll. For a long time, it ran at about 50%, saying that it shot up to 82% in the early 90s. Same percentage described the economy as inherently unfair. Same percentage say that workers have too little voice in public affairs, in economic and other affairs. More than 70% say that business has too much power and is benefiting more than consumers from deregulation. About 2/3 say that the American dream is getting harder to reach. And in what Business Week calls a stunning majority of 95 to 5%. These are incidentally figures you almost never get in polls. By 95 to 5%, the population believes that corporations should sacrifice profit for workers and communities. That really sent the fear of God into them. Well, such analyses of public attitudes are perfectly consistent with what you see at the primaries, clearly, and they do suggest a certain conclusion, but it's not the conclusion that has been drawn. So, for example, the reporter, business reporter who reported 4 years ago that the polls that he reported a talk by the head of the Harris Polling Organization, which pointed out that people were describing that 83% of the population was describing the economy as inherently unfair, with the rich getting richer and the rich getting poorer. His analysis of that is that people are angry at politicians and want more power to the people, not more power to the government. Well, that's kind of an intriguing description of the observation that 83% of the population describe the economy as inherently unfair. But that interpretation, perverse as it may sound, makes a certain amount of sense if you accept two basic principles, which indeed are the basic principles of the propaganda system. One is that the government cannot, it's just impossible for the government to serve public interests. The government cannot be of, for, and by the people. That's out of the question. And secondly, the principle that private power does not exist. Even though the Fortune 500 control about 2/3 of the domestic economy and much of the world economy, private power doesn't exist. So if you believe that, like the government is necessarily an enemy and private power doesn't exist, then you can look at the conclusion that says 83% of the population thinks that the economy is inherently unfair, and these other observations, and the conclusion you draw is that people are angry at politicians and they want more power to the people, not to the government. And there's a picture that lies behind this. The picture is a picture of the social world is as one with a conflict. The government is the enemy. There's two sides. The government is the enemy, and on the other side is the people who live together in harmony. And the people include the sober working man, his loyal wife, maybe now the job herself, the hard-working business executive who's toiling 18 hours a day for the common good, the friendly banker who's looking for people to give money to, and so on, all living together in harmony, working together, and the whole thing kind of only disrupted by big government, which is the enemy, and then by kind of outsiders who disrupt, who are un-American and riffraff, like labor organizers and other people like that. Well, actually, that is a picture. That's a picture that's been crafted quite consciously by the public relations industry and the entertainment industry and a good deal of the popular intellectual culture, consciously crafted from the 1930s, when business was terrified by the passage of the New Deal legislation, and the business press talked about the hazard facing industrialists and the rising political power of the masses, and called on doing something to overcome this, and launched a huge propaganda campaign, really took off after the Second World War, based precisely on these images, which in fact have persisted right until today in the entertainment industry and television and the business, a good bit of the culture. And if you accept that, and if you take that framework, well, the conclusions that I just described are not totally irrational. Well, it's kind of a tribute to the propaganda system that when the dam finally broke in 1996, and a quite cynical demagogue was able to use a class conflict theme for personal efforts at personal gain, picking up and mutilating traditional attitudes of the left. When that finally happened, there was great shock and alarm. It was kind of interesting to look at. The New York Times had a magazine story which said that Buchanan has opened a second front in the class war. Before that, he said, the author said, angry people had been expressing their anger in an approved fashion in the first front of the class war. That is, they were targeting welfare families, immigrants, and beneficiaries of affirmative action. But now it seems they're discovering something else. Bosses, investors, owners, even class conflict. I mean, really exotic features of the contemporary scene which hadn't been noticed before, but which these strange people are finding. And that's the second front in the class war, and now we've got some real problems. Ears that had been tuned to a little different part of the spectrum could have made the discovery a little before, maybe 20 years earlier, when, for example, it might have heard the head of the UAW, Doug Fraser, president of UAW, denouncing business in 1978 for fighting a one-sided class war against working people, the poor, minorities, the defenseless, and even many in the middle classes. Could have heard the same message 20 years earlier in the 1950s when there still existed a rather substantial labor press, about 800 newspapers reaching 20, 30 million people a year before it had been sort of wiped out by the fact that the resources are all located elsewhere. Same message, fighting the offensive of corporate America, and indeed long before, all the way back to the origins of the Industrial Revolution. But that's if you're listening to different voices, not the ones that you're supposed to listen to if you're well educated. Newsweek had a response also. They were concerned that we're entering a new blame era. And the articles pointed out, articles and editorials, that people are confused and misguided. They don't understand this complicated new world. And misguided people, it says, always look for malign forces to explain their own failures and miseries. It used to be Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. Now it's corporate executives, top-level managers, investment bankers, and other movers and shakers and deal makers in the burgeoning business universe, which ordinary people just don't understand. So they are scapegoating these innocents, just as they scapegoated Jews and immigrants and blacks in the past, which is kind of understandable but unfortunate. Went on to say that it used to be that people blamed big government for their economic woes, which is the right thing, like blaming welfare mothers. But now they're shifting their anger to big business, which is dangerous. And it says only the foolish would ignore the signs, and talks to its constituency, corporations, as saying it's necessary to become more responsible corporate citizens, the way the population thinks by 20 to 1, or else there may be real trouble. Notice this is just the usual cycle, now repeating. Standard cycle, now repeating exactly the comments I quoted from Barron's earlier. Still, it's extremely interesting and very revealing to look at the range of options that's considered now that harmony has been disrupted by a misguided public who's scapegoating these nice guys and cynical politicians. So now we have a broader spectrum, and the spectrum ranges between two extremes. One extreme says that corporate rulers, should ruthlessly seek profit, period, and the others say that they should be more benevolent autocrats. That's the frame of reference. That's the spectrum. And then you take your stand between those two extremes. Well, there are some things missing here, too. So, for example, missing are the thoughts of, say, Thomas Jefferson, who warned about what he called moneyed incorporations and banking institutions, which, if allowed to develop, he said, would undermine the democratic revolution and return the country to absolutism. Or Alexis de Tocqueville, a couple of years later, who, like other people whose roots were in the Enlightenment, regarded equality of condition, not equality of opportunity, but equality of condition. He's a classical liberal, and that was taken for granted, like Adam Smith and Jefferson and others. Equality of condition was something that was an essential feature of a just society and essential for democracy, his topic. And he warned that of the rise of the manufacturing aristocracy in the United States, which he said is one of the harshest that has ever existed. I said if they in fact get free rein, that will mean the end of democracy and a condition of permanent inequality in the United States. Or people like, say, John Dewey, America's leading social philosopher in this century, who made similar points. He said it's pointless to talk about democracy. You can't talk about it seriously as long as you have what he called a feudalistic business system, meaning private power for private profit, running industry, finance, media, commerce, and so on. Under those conditions of industrial feudalism, democracy can't really exist. Politics will only be the shadow cast by big business over society. So anyone who believes in democracy will have to dismantle industrial feudalism and move towards industrial democracy by simply dismantling all these structures, which are illegitimate totalitarian structures. Those are ideas that go right back to the origins of classical liberalism, right through to today. They were standard in the working class press 150 years ago, not far from here, around eastern Massachusetts, where people were struggling against what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth forgetting all but self. That's the devil take the hindmost society of perfection, which they regarded as degrading and destructive of dignity and freedom and culture. And they were not pleading with the new manufacturing aristocracy to be more benevolent. They were simply denying its legitimacy altogether. They were denying it any right to be either harsh or benevolent, held, as did the whole tradition, that those who work in the mills should own them, and that they should not be nicer to communities and workers, but rather they should disappear like other illegitimate structures, and democratic forms should decide how to use and distribute resources, not plead with the autocrats to be a little more benevolent. Well, all of that is all, I should say, is absolutely pure, straight mainstream America, as American as apple pie, all without the benefit or harm, depending how you look at it, of radical intellectuals, just authentic American tradition, and absolutely part of the real core of American history. I haven't been talking about exotic figures, you'll notice. But it's all missing, all gone. The spectrum is much narrower. The spectrum now is, we ask whether the reigning autocrats should act more kindly to their subjects. And at the extreme, there are proposals that maybe public policy ought to bribe them to be more benevolent by, benefiting those who aren't so extreme in their corporate greed. And then if you look at the discussions of it, it says, well, there are these people with these strange radical ideas. We should bribe the autocrats to be more benevolent. But that's not welcome to corporate America. I'm quoting a recent think piece on this in the Boston Globe. That's not welcome to corporate America and Congress, who are committed to free markets to balance competing interests. So that explains why Congress is increasing the Pentagon budget, which transfers funds from the public to high technology industry. And in fact, it has been its major function since the 1950s, which is why one of the reasons why the Pentagon spending doesn't decline, in fact, is going up, despite the disappearance of the Russians. But that doesn't interfere with the fact that they're all committed to free markets to balance competing interests, and we can go on and on. All of this has to do with something else that is as unthinkable as the idea that private autocracies are illegitimate. As I say, a truism right through mainstream American history. But it's also unthinkable that private power is not committed to free markets. In fact, never has been. What it's been committed to is something quite different, what you might call, really existing free market doctrine, which is fine for you, but not for me, except for temporary advantage. I need the protection of the nanny state. That has been the unwavering position of free market enthusiasts ever since the doctrines were developed in the early 19th century. And it's right, it's not just the United States, it's everywhere. So there was a recent study of the top 100 transnationals in the Fortune list of transnationals, top 100 of them. It turned out that all 100 had benefited from the state industrial policies of the country in which they're located, meaning public support, subsidy of one kind, and 20 of the 100 had been saved from total destruction simply by public bailouts when they got into trouble. That's the top 100 transnationals. Most of them are American, but it's all over the world, of course. Well, there's no need to explain all of this sort of thing to people like, say, Newt Gingrich or the Heritage Foundation or the Reaganites. They've understood it quite well, which is why, for example, the Reaganites massively increased, in fact, doubled protection for, basically closed off the American market to prevent to allow and provided public funds to allow the steel industry and the semiconductor industry and other major industries to survive, auto industry. They in fact introduced more tariffs, more protective measures than all preceding post-war administrations combined. And it's not necessary to explain it to Newt Gingrich, who happens to be the country's leading welfare freak. He brings more federal subsidies to his rich constituents in Cobb County, Georgia, than any suburban county in the country outside the federal system, or to the Heritage Foundation, who plans the Republican budget and is calling for increase in the Pentagon budget, understanding perfectly well how this system works. For them, the lessons are all clear. It's the public who's not supposed to understand, just as it's not supposed to understand that there might be something outside the spectrum of pleading with the autocrats to be more benevolent or just saying, well, ruthlessly seek profit. Let's go back to the primaries and take another look at what was missing, which is again revealing in more detail. One of the striking things that was missing in the primaries from the very beginning was Phil Gramm. That was noticed by the Wall Street Journal, which pointed out that Graham's well-funded campaign was the first one to collapse, and it also pointed out that this is kind of striking because he was the one presidential standard bearer for the congressional Republicans, but he was wiped out instantly, despite the fact that he was well-funded and was making all the right noises. The Wall Street Journal called this the cruelest irony of the campaign. Another Wall Street Journal article pointed out that Newt Gingrich and the contract with America were almost unmentioned in the primaries. None of this will come as any surprise to people who've been following public opinion polls, public opinion studies. In 1994, when the congressional conservatives won the Great Revolution, about 60% of the population wanted social spending to increase. By about 6 to 1, the population wanted opposed increase of Pentagon spending. In contrast, 60% wanted social spending to increase. Well, they did exactly the opposite. Clinton's first response to the elections was to increase Pentagon spending and to start cutting social spending, and the congressional Republicans just outdid him. And so it's continued right through since 1994 over overwhelming public objection. So it's not too surprising that the politicians, as soon as they had to leave the Beltway and face what Alexander Hamilton once called the great beast, namely the public, as soon as they had to do that, they dropped their agenda like a hot potato. That's no cruel irony, but just simple realism, as is the fact that they're still pursuing the agenda while nobody's looking. Again, as before, no irony, just realism. The most dramatic example of this, pointed out by a number of commentators, was the budget. Remember that just a few weeks right before the primaries started, the biggest item, the most important item in the world was balancing the budget. It had closed the government a couple of times. The only discussion that was going on was as to whether we ought to do it in 7 years or maybe a couple of months longer, but that the top priority must be balancing the budget was unquestioned. All of a sudden, politicians have to face the great beast, and there's no more talk about balancing the budget. Disappeared quickly. The Wall Street Journal had a headline saying that the voters apparently have abandoned their obsession with budget balancing. Their obsession with budget balancing was strong opposition to it under any realistic conditions, as had continually been pointed out right through this whole period. Well, again, no cruel irony, but simple realism. To be honest, it should be mentioned that some percentage of the public did share the obsession of both political parties with balancing the budget, namely 5%. That was about the 5% of the public thought that balancing the budget was the highest priority. Exactly the same percent felt that homelessness was the highest priority. But the 5% who thought that balancing the budget was the highest priority happened to include business leaders. Business Week ran a poll of CEOs which came out with the conclusion, American business speaks, balance the budget. That was their conclusion. And when American business speaks, the political class listens, and the commentators report, and so on. And if misguided people thought that they opposed balancing the budget under realistic conditions, as they were telling people taking polls, if they really thought that, they could say tune into NPR, the ultra-liberal source of knowledge and insight, where All Things Considered explained to them that Americans voted for a balanced budget and wanted the budget balanced even at the cost of education cutbacks and health cutbacks and so on. That's exactly contrary to the polls, which consistently were saying the exact opposite. Well, again, it's not surprising that all this stuff falls off the screen as soon as it's necessary to face the great beast in the public arena, even if most of them are staying home. The standard story since 1994, November 94, has been that the Gingrich free market enthusiasts are pursuing the poll-driven contract with America in our pluralistic democracy, because that's the way it works. It's been obvious from the beginning that this is total fraud, at least anyone who looked at the polls, and now we don't have to argue about it anymore because it's conceded, at least in the business press. The pollster, for the Gingrich pollster, the guy who does the polls for them, Frank Luntz is his name, he gave a press conference in which he was asked, how come you keep telling us that your polls show that the public supports all 10 parts of the contract when the polls we look at say that they oppose them? And he said, look, we're not, when I give you the numbers saying, this is the percentage that favor the, these items in the contract with America, I'm not talking about their content. I'm talking about the slogans in which they're packaged. So the way it works, he explained, is that we take focus groups and we ask them, what, like take, say, health. We ask people, do you want the health system dismantled? Everybody says, or, even reduced. No, everybody hates it. But you ask people, do you want the health system preserved and strengthened and made viable for the next generation? And then everybody thinks that slogan's fine. So as we proceed to dismantle the health system, we call it preserving and strengthening the health system for the benefit of the next generation. And that's what I was telling you. It's the slogans they like, the packaging, not the substance. Substance, of course, they oppose. Well, okay, since the point is now conceded, we don't have to debate it anymore. The only thing we should notice is that all of this is extremely natural in a business-run society. That is a society based very extensively on manipulation and deceit, what's called marketing, and that's what it is. It's the creation of artificial wants, the marginalization of people, the changing their attitudes and so on, and that's not a small amount. Incidentally, the latest academic study I've seen estimates that about $1 trillion a year are spent in the United States just on marketing. It's about 1/6 or 1/7 of gross domestic product, big sum. A lot of that straight propaganda. And the point of it is also explained very frankly the leading manual of the public relations industry back in the 1920s, incidentally written by a good Roosevelt Kennedy liberal, and much respected, says that what he calls the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is the essence of democracy, and it is the responsibility of the intelligent minorities to carry out that manipulation. Yeah, that's right, and that's echoed by leading Wilsonian and other intellectuals, and it indeed is the essence of democracy as understood. And under those conditions, with huge amount of effort going into marketing and what's called the everlasting battle for the minds of men who must be indoctrinated with the capitalist story and so on, I'm quoting top business leaders, when that is the guiding principle, and democracy is considered the great threat, it's not too surprising that you should have what I just described. Well, there's nothing new about this. Maybe something new. Maybe the scale is new, or maybe the brazenness of all of it. But you know, even here one begins to wonder. So when the Reaganites were talking about free markets, you have to assume that this was tongue-in-cheek. I mean, it was so obvious that they were undermining market principles in their domestic policies while ramming them down the throats of anyone defenseless overseas or at home, that the commentary on this, it's hard to imagine that it was serious. But, you know, by now one begins to wonder, actually. So let me take a couple of recent examples, and I'll end with this. The Wall Street Journal had a lead article a couple of weeks ago in which it compared the business, it talked about various states and the different strategies they're taking to become more business friendly and to attract entrepreneurs. And it picked as its example two states, this lead story, picked Virginia and Maryland. And it talked about, you know, the slightly different strategies and described them and so on. And it said Virginia's doing better, you know, better strategy, more business friendly. Well, actually, it turns out when you look, it wasn't Virginia and Maryland. It was the suburbs of Washington, some of which happened to be in Virginia and some happened to be in Maryland. And the suburbs of Washington, the states had indeed picked different strategies for the suburbs of Washington. The state of Maryland took a gamble, thought the big growth area for the suburbs of Washington would be in the biology-based industries, which are funded by the National Institute of Health and, you know, other federal agencies that pour money into biology-based industry. Virginia, on the other hand, had staked its bets on the traditional cash cow, the Pentagon system, so therefore was focusing on high-tech industry, telecommunications, you know, information processing, and so on. And that had turned out to be a better decision. They had made a better guess about the choices facing entrepreneurs, the Wall Street Journal pointed out. And the choices facing entrepreneurs turn out to be which public funds to loot. Maryland made a bad decision because more public funds were being poured into this other sector of the economy. So Virginia is the winner in this, in creating a business-friendly environment in this way. Let's go on to Foreign Affairs, the leading international affairs journal. Current issue has an article by Dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard, who points out that American diplomacy has a new weapon which hasn't been given enough, hasn't been recognized enough, a force multiplier. He says that's the attraction of American democracy in free markets, and then he spells it out. Cold War investments enabled U.S. industry to dominate telecommunications, information processing, and other emerging technologies. So how did Cold War investment do that? Well, by public funds. And in fact, public funds that are in fact a subsidy to industry presented under the guise of security. And that is conscious deception. We know that from the public record back to the 1940s when the Truman administration pointed out that the word to use is not subsidy, the word to use is security when you want to have the government intervene to maintain advanced sectors of industry, which, as the business press made clear, simply cannot survive in a competitive, unsubsidized, free enterprise economy, so the government has to be the savior, but under the guise of security, not subsidy. So what we're learning from the dean of the Kennedy School is that it's a tribute to democracy and markets when the public is tricked into subsidizing the rich under the guise of security. Great tribute to markets and democracy. Companion article by a Boston International lawyer says that the road to market reforms, discusses a right-wing libertarian group that discovered that the road to market reforms is Silicon Valley and Route 128. And he goes on to talk about their entrepreneurial values and their universities and so on. Unmentioned is the fact that both of them crucially depend on huge public subsidies through the whole Pentagon system, including DOE and NASA and so on. Well, what all of this just illustrates is that the concept of free enterprise has simply come to mean that the public pays the costs and the public assumes the risks. If anything goes wrong, then you get the bailouts. And that's free enterprise as long as the profits are privatized and as long as you can, and then quite naturally you want to shift decision-making from the public arena where maybe the public could influence it over to the private tyrannies where they can't influence it at all. Well, that's kind of, that's pretty much the essence of public policy and the ideology behind it. I'll give one last example from the liberal New Yorker where Thomas Cassaday writes has a pretty good article. He also discovered, the woes of the American middle class, how they're suffering. And he goes on to describe it pretty accurately, and then ends up saying it's nobody's fault. It's what the free market has decided in its infinite and mysterious wisdom, and politicians have to wake up and just accept the fact that nothing can be done about what amount to laws of nature. And he even mentions a couple of corporations in this study, in fact 3. He mentions 3 corporations, McDonnell Douglas, Grumman, and Hughes. I mean, all paradigm examples of publicly subsidized private profit corporations. That demonstrates what the free market has decided in its infinite and mysterious wisdom, which makes about as much sense as when Clinton announced his grand vision for the free market future to much applause in a hangar of the Boeing Corporation, picking Boeing as the chief leading model of the grand vision of the free market future. I mean, couldn't pick a better example of a corporation that wouldn't even exist unless the public was pouring public funds into it. You take a plane somewhere, you're flying a modified bomber, including the metallurgy and the avionics and everything else. Or take, say, Newt Gingrich, whose favorite example of free enterprise is Lockheed. This one is even more extreme because that one was actually bailed out. It was going to collapse, but the Reaganites poured funds into it to salvage it. Okay, that's free enterprise. Well, again, none of this stuff is particularly new. The British were playing the same games before the United States even came along, imposing free market rules by force on India, which deindustrialized it, while heavily protecting their own markets and constructing a very powerful state, which is how they industrialized. Same policies were followed by their former colonies as soon as they liberated themselves, and so it goes on up till the present. And as I mentioned, perfection and finality have often been proclaimed in the course of all of this, always wrongly. Well, with all the sordid continuities, and they're really ugly, I think it's still possible to perceive over time significant, if slow, progress. So popular struggles today to reverse these tendencies and move forward, they start from much higher ground than they did, say, in the gay 90s or the roaring 20s or even 30 years ago. Today, you don't have to try to gain workers' rights or Social Security or some level of medical care. You have to protect it, okay, and advance it. That's a big step forward. And the violence that's used to suppress popular struggle is considerably lower than it was in the past. It cannot be mobilized as it was in the past. And so on. Popular attitudes have changed. They start from somewhere else. Well, that's progress. And there's no more reason than there ever has been in the past to believe that somehow we're constrained by mysterious and unknown laws, not just decisions that are made in human institutions, decisions that are subject to human will, as is the existence of the institutions themselves, as has always been true in the past. Okay, that's what I have to say. Now it's for you.
Hi, I'm Logan Patrick with the New England Central America Network. In a few moments, we're going to let you ask a few questions. We're going to turn it over to them, and they're going to be able to take your questions for Dr. Chomsky. Thanks, guys.
We're going to have a brief question and answer period. Because of the time, it's just going to be short. Gail and I are going to go out into the audience with a microphone so Dr. Chomsky can better hear you.
Yeah, Gail's going to have the mic there.
Hi, Dr. Chomsky.
Yeah.
My name is Chuck. I'm an education major. You didn't address the issue, but it's a big issue about education. Our education system is going on the tubes. I don't know if you saw a recent USA or US Weekly article. We have the lowest attendance rate of any industrialized nation. Our kids can't even make the standards. Our education becomes so watered down. Everybody goes to college and thinks that they get a college education and they're Einstein. What do you think about that and what can we do about that?
Well, first thing I would suggest is that you take a careful look at the facts because they've been very much misrepresented. There are some good academic studies of them, starting with the Nation at Risk study of the Reagan administration back in the early 80s. There's been a steady falsification of the record about American education. In fact, it has plenty of problems, but most of what's said about it is indeed fabrication. There's one good recent academic study that came out just surveying the evidence. The reason for the fabrication is quite obvious. It's part of the effort to undermine support for public education by making it appear as if it can't work, so therefore we've got to move over to some privatized system which will be just like privatized health reform or any other deregulation and so on, private transportation, a way of subsidizing the rich at the expense of the poor. So point number one is have a look at the facts. The fact that they appeared in, was it USA Today or some U.S. News and World report, that's not sufficient. Take a look back and check what they actually say. What they actually say, as far as I'm aware, is that that there has been a steady increase in the success of the public education system, and it's more or less, you get what you pay for, essentially. The United States has more of the population attending school at the higher levels, way more than most countries, and has much worse education than other industrial countries at the lowest levels, just as no daycare centers and so on. And you get the effects of that you would expect. But the answer is, I think it's clear what the answer is, put more public resources into what's needed by the public, namely education. I wish I remembered the name of the book that I have in mind, but if you're interested and if you drop me a note, I'll give you the reference. Yeah. Can't remember the name. Yeah. You got one? Yeah.
My name is Asim Srivastava. I'm a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts. I'd like to get your impressions from your recent trip to India, especially your perception of the aspirations of the Indian elite in the context of globalization and what possibilities do you foresee for challenging that. Also, if you could give us a sense of what changes you saw in India over the last 30, 25 years that you lived in
That's a big question, and I'll only try to say a couple words about it. As far as the big debate in India now is whether to proceed with what are called reforms. That is structural adjustment, neoliberalism, opening up the markets, kind of like here. Should you proceed with what are called reforms? This is called some new departure for India. In fact, it's not a new departure. It's about 3 centuries old. A good part of the reason why India is India and England is England is that these reforms were rammed down India's throat by the British in the 18th century. From 1600 to 1800, right about then, India was the world's leading manufacturing center. Not just textiles, but it was producing, for example, as much iron as all of Western Europe. India was, you could argue about whether India would have had an industrial revolution or not. Nobody knows enough to say. But what we do know is that India was impoverished, turned into a poor agrarian society, and deindustrialized by the imposition of neoliberal reforms, while England protected its industry massively, had huge tariffs against Indian imports, in fact wouldn't even let forced British goods into India and so on, and that continued right through the laissez-faire period. Well, those are big factors in why the countries are different. In fact, if you ask why, it's even interesting to compare the United States and India. It sounds like a funny comparison until you look more closely and you find that it's not funny at all. The same years as the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, in those same years, England was fighting a big war, the Anglo-Maratha War in India. It's hard for Americans to remember this, but the Revolutionary War was kind of a sideshow as far as England was concerned. There was big international war going on between England and France and other major countries. And for England, one big piece of it was in India, and another big piece here. Right at the same time, they were mainly fighting France, and in India, it was a standoff with a local military force, though England later conquered India. Here, England, for all kind of reasons, was compelled to depart, and the United States could then follow the same course that England followed. The United States became, the leading developmental state. The very high protective tariffs, state intervention, crushed everybody in its way, very much as England had done, and ended up being an industrial society. India couldn't follow that course. So the New England textile industry around the 1820s, according to the few studies by economic historians, not something people study much, apparently about half of it would have been destroyed instantly if they had dropped the protective tariffs. When the railroad boom came along at the end of the century, the United States, the policy required that you use American steel, blocking cheaper and better British steel. India could have produced locomotives. In fact, Bombay was producing locomotives perfectly competitively. The British wouldn't allow it. The British forced British steel into India. And so it goes. So you get a big difference. Well, that's neoliberal policies. The question whether they ought to be instituted today is, you have to judge it on its own merits, but there's nothing new about it. There's 3 centuries of Indian history that bear on the question and much else. As for elites, well, it's not 100%, of course, but the overwhelming attitude of elites is like everywhere. They're in favor of them. And that's not surprising. They benefit from them, just as here. So, for example, when reforms are instituted here, say people at my income level benefit. I'm sure without checking that I gained economically from the Reagan years, while median real wages were going down, just because of where people like me stand in the income level. The health reforms will presumably have the same effect. Taxes for the wealthy will go down, services for the poor will also go down, and the costs will be transferred over to the poor. So it goes across the board. So it's not, and that's the way it's been since the first such experiment was carried out in India in 1793. The permanent settlement, which had exactly the effect of enriching the landowners and local elites and devastating the domestic population. Well, the fact that elites support it is not terribly surprising, and they typically have tended to do that, not just in India and the United States, but all over the world. They tend to support, people tend to support policies which will benefit themselves. You know. So yeah, one of the effects of structural adjustment and neoliberalism and all the way back to the 18th century is that the people who are designing the experiments invariably come out very well. And that includes the intellectual elites who justify them. On the other hand, the experimental animals, who incidentally don't sign consent forms, they typically take it in the chin. You know, they may gain incidentally, but it's not the goal, and often they suffer. That having been said, not a lot is understood about these matters. There really isn't. Honest economists will tell you most of the factors in economic development just aren't understood. So, for example, about 2/3 of the rise in per capita income in the United States over the years, that's the best studied case, about 2/3 of it is attributed to what's called the residual, which means what we don't understand at all, you know, and that's the best studied case. So one has to approach these things with a certain diffidence. Nevertheless, there are historical lessons, and I think you can draw some conclusions about them. You have to look at it in terms of the present contingencies. But I don't think the general, not universal, but general attitude of elites is terribly surprising if you ask who's going to gain and who's going to lose, same as here. How's India changed in the last years? Well, you know, significantly. So, for example, domestic production, domestic manufacturing, in the last few years, one of the effects of the reforms, just in the last few years, has been, it's brought in a lot of foreign investment, the so-called reforms, because of course foreign investors like it. But it's not productive investment. It's mostly speculation. And what else there is taking over the commercial market. So you get American brand names all over the place. Well, that instead of Indian-produced manufacturers, which are just as good, you know, that's no contribution to the health of the economy. It's great for the Western investors and the local elites who are associated with them. The advertising has shot up in India in the last couple of years. A huge boom in advertising. The 10 leading Indian advertisers are now subsidiaries of multinationals, meaning they're basically foreign advertisers. And they do exactly what you'd expect. They advertise, they use their huge resources to advertise Western brands to try to undercut Indian brands. And you see that all over. You know, you see that, and you can't miss that as you walk. You know, I mean, at least if you're part of the overwhelming majority in India who are too poor for this to matter, well, probably don't see it. But if you're part of what they call the middle classes, you know, that little sector that's supposedly gaining from the reforms, yeah, you see it. And there are a lot of other changes like that. The Wall Street Journal had an interesting article. There was one today, and there was another one a couple of days ago, on the current election that's going on, which more or less tells the story. What they said is people in India have gained from the reforms, but the voters don't seem to understand it. They're not voting for the party that brought them the reforms. Another confusion of these stupid people who've been so confused since the 1820s when they failed to see the obvious, how much you gain when other people are enriched and you get poorer. You know, it's really hard for people to get that through their heads somehow, and it's showing up again in the elections. But there's a lot more to say. You know, India's a big, complicated, rich country, and a little bit of it, even the little bit I understand, would take a long time to discuss.
This is going to be the last question. I'm sorry. We're really running out of time. I want to thank everyone for coming. And I'm turning it over to this one lucky person for the last one.
It's better than winning the raffle.
Well, I guess I'm the lucky one here. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Chomsky, if you could give your social analysis of the New Patriot movement. And
several things call themselves that. Which one do you mean?
Well, I guess I'm talking about the so-called anti-government.
The militia.
Yeah, the
militia type patriot movement. Yeah, because there are others too. Okay.
And
yeah.
where are they coming from? And are there any? what are their links, if any, to actual powers that be, or are they just a reaction against it, and what does it bode for us?
Well, I don't think they're like being run by the CIA or anything like that. I think they're kind of very spontaneous, coming out of things which, first of all, have their roots in American history and have their roots in the current scene. The militias are just, this so-called patriot movement is just one aspect. Notice, first of all, that their slogans are very much like what the whole propaganda system has been trying to ram into your heads for 50 years. The government is the enemy, and private power doesn't exist. Okay? Now, it's obvious why big corporations who are fighting the everlasting battle for the minds of men would want that to be the picture you have. If the government is your enemy, and you can, let's say, when 83% of the population think the economic system is inherently unfair, that's supposed to mean they're angry at the government. If you can take that view, then those who run the private institutions are quite well off. There's no threat of democracy. They can run things peacefully. The people are demoralized, and the normal methods of democratic participation to gain social ends are excluded. So it makes good sense for corporate propaganda, which means most of what we see and hear. It makes it good sense for it to be trying to stress the message that the government is the enemy, and to de-stress, in fact, eliminate from sight the fact that private power exists. So government is the enemy, everybody else is in harmony. That's been the message. Well, the militias just take that a step further. They kind of take it to its logical extension. Yeah, okay, government's the enemy, let's blow up the federal building. Okay? So in a sense, they're kind of hearing the indoctrination and taking it literally. Well, it also has deeper roots in American history, but apart from that, remember that this is a very cult-ridden society. The militias are a cult, and they're only one, and by no means the major one. The civil society has pretty much collapsed in the United States. People are isolated, they're atomized, they don't believe in the political system, they don't take part in it, they don't organize in other ways. The unions are very weak, which have been the leading democratizing force in most of modern history. This kind of constructive civil society has been very much demolished. It's kind of striking to compare the richest country in the world, the United States, with the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, namely Haiti, where peasants and people in the slums and so on did construct and have sustained, amazingly, a very lively, vibrant civil society with grassroots organizations and unions and all sorts of things, and had an effect. They got their own president into office. Well, that conception of democracy has been knocked out of people's heads here. We could do well to go to the Haitian slums and try to learn something about what democracy is. But here it has been very much dissolved. People feel lonely, isolated, atomized, me in the tube, they don't do anything with anyone else. The normal methods of interchange and constructive action, like for example unions or political organizations, are very weak by comparative standards. Well, how do people react to that? Well, one of the ways they react is people just don't give up. They form other ways of associating. And the other ways of associating are often extremely irrational. So the United States is a deeply fundamentalist country. If you look cross-culturally, at the, by and large, fundamentalist commitments, like, say, literal belief in the devil, or a belief that the world was created 10,000 years ago, that kind of thing. The beliefs of that nature tend to decline as industrialization increases. Industrialization, education, and so on. As they increase, those beliefs tend to decline. And it's a pretty close correlation. The United States is off the spectrum. It's like a poor, devastated peasant society after the Black Plague or something, in its level of fundamentalist commitment. And that's an overwhelming fact. Like half the population thinks that the world was created 10,000 years ago. You just don't find that anywhere in the world. There's all sorts of cults of this kind. They're on the left too. Like a very large part of the left is deeply immersed in completely mad ideas about weird conspiracies as to, who killed Kennedy or something, or what the Federal Reserve is doing or something like that. I mean, these are, you know, strange cults that do arise in devastated societies. They were true of Europe after the Black Plague, for example. And we find a lot of that in the United States. I think that's a reflection of the dissolution of functioning civil society and constructive ways of responding. The militias are just one piece of it, and they happen to be picking out the major theme of the propaganda system. You can't say they invented it. That's exactly what people are told all the time. Yeah, government's the enemy. You can't do anything through the political system because it's your enemy. So therefore let us, who run the private system, let us run everything and don't bother us. Okay, that's essentially what they're doing. So they're not inventing it. They're just exaggerating something that has been the primary theme of propaganda for 50 years. And doing it in a way which you can kind of understand in a dissolving society where there's plenty of other, and in fact much bigger and more, I think, more dangerous cults developing. Well, you know, all of that can be reversed. It's happened in the past, and it's been reversed. Unions were much worse off in the 1920s, and they barely existed. In the 1890s, I mean, not only didn't they exist, they were being, you know, people trying to organize were simply being murdered by security forces. In fact, that went on into the 1930s here, okay? Things are better than they were, you know. But it can be recovered the way it's been recovered in the past. That's why we live in a better country than it was 60 years ago, much better than it was 100 years ago. Okay, keep doing it. But I don't think it seems to me the militias are kind of like a fringe of a much broader phenomenon.
You mentioned some disturbing trends. Can you mention positive?
I mentioned the positive one. We're way better off than we were 30 years ago. Like take say healthcare, okay? In the 1960s, that's not long ago, the problem was to try to institute some limited measure of health service for the general population. We didn't have it. Okay, now we have something. You know, it's like it's not the kind of...
Compared to Europe,
yes, but, well, I don't agree with that. You compare to Europe, it's just, you know, they're different dimensions. Like if you compare it on the level of healthcare, yeah, we're going nowhere. If you compare it on the level of, say, individual freedom, I think we're way beyond them. All right, take an institution, take, say, universities, okay, since we're to college. American universities are incomparably better than any others in the world. Not only do they bring in way more people, a much larger part of the population goes to college and university, but they also get, you know, a better education. It's kind of striking when you teach in an American university. You know, if you compare students at the graduation from high school level, the ones in the United States aren't at the same level as the Europeans and the Japanese. You compare them 4 years later, they're at the same level.
Yeah, but are we just making corporate moves?
No, we're not just doing that. I mean, we're doing a lot of things.
Europe has more time off, say, for the workers.
That's right. So European working standards, aside from England, are better. That's one respect in which there are things to gain in the United States. But there are plenty of respects in which the United States is better. You know, it's not like there's it's a list. But the relevant question is, how do we stand as compared with where we were? Okay, and we're a lot better off. In the 1960s, for example, let's say, take something like protection of freedom of speech. I think it's a terribly important thing. The United States is just way better than any other country I know of in this respect. And that was mostly won in the 1960s. Up until the 1960s, we were pretty much like Europe. There was no real guarantee for freedom of speech. That was won in the course of the civil rights struggle, if you look back at the Supreme Court rulings. The same is true of lots of other things.
Now that we're talking about freedom of speech, we have to interrupt and say, oh, we're sorry, but we have to impact on your freedom of speech and tell you we can't take any more questions.
Can I make one last optimistic comment? Let me mention something that's pretty recent, which doesn't get talked about much, and it's relevant to the appeal that was just made. The Central America solidarity movements in the United States in the 1980s are something which never existed in Europe. In its whole ugly, vicious, imperial past and present, and never existed in the United States until the 1980s. Namely, large-scale, massive public movements way beyond anything in the 1960s deeply rooted in the mainstream, which were actually engaging themselves in the lives and struggles, directly participating, of people who were under attack from the imperial power. I mean, no one in Europe ever dreamed of that, nor was it dreamed of here during the Indochina Wars. But it was pretty common in Main Street America, you know, very mainstream American society in the 1980s. Well, that's a reflection of extremely healthy elements in American society and culture, and they shouldn't be denigrated.
On behalf of Springfield College.
Thank you, Dr. Chomsky, for your presentation.
Don't always see how the different parts of the movement connect each other. For you people who are science fiction fans, sometimes it's almost as if we're each in our own little dimension. We're really standing right side by side with each other, and we're separated only by the smallest moment of time or awareness to realize that we are connected with each other. But sometimes we do break through, and we get that sense of feeling. For me, I think one of the times recently when I've really felt that we were part of the same movement was during the Gulf War. And I saw Springfield and Western Mass, in fact, come together and organize in a way that I haven't seen around many other issues. Student groups, African American groups, social justice groups like Arise, low-income groups, you name it, and we knew that what was happening in the Gulf affected us. And we really understood when the war was going on what it was all about. Unfortunately, when the war changed focus, and I won't say ended, but when the war changed focus, we lost our focus. When the war switched to an economic front instead of a very obvious body count that we could see on the media every day, well, it seemed as if we weren't needed anymore, if the desire for unity sort of dissipated. And yet we still have an embargo in Iraq, against Iraq, that's causing devastating loss of life for people in Iraq. We have our own veterans who are crying out for media attention as they try to deal with the Gulf War syndrome. But because the battle is on an economic front, it doesn't seem as real to us. And the same thing happened in Central America. When the troops pulled out and it became an economic war instead, it was harder to see. And the same thing is happening here in this country, but we tend not to notice it. And yet we have to trust our ability to. My name is Michael Ann Busey, and I'm a board member of Arise for Social Justice, and also a member of the New England Central America Network. That's two of the organizations that you have to thank for putting this together, but also here at Springfield College, the Newman Community, the Office Ministries, and New Horizons in Haiti. You know, some people said that we couldn't draw a crowd or fill a hall in Springfield for Noam Chomsky, that there wouldn't be enough people interested in coming. I know that most of you are here for one reason only, and that's to hear Mr. Chomsky give his analysis of power and what's happening in our community. And of course, that's a big reason we're here, but we have a number of other reasons for hosting this event in Springfield also. One of them is because this is a fundraiser, and you will hear more about that as the evening goes on. But really, the main reason that we wanted to have this event in Springfield is because we want a chance to keep building on the sense of community and the sense of movement that we feel here in Springfield and in Western Mass. We want a chance to start developing a really good analysis of what it will take to have social and economic justice in this country. And we want to build unity here. because we are part of a movement. Even though we may not always realize that. I'm struck that most of us in creative writing classes have been told that when we're writing a paper, we need to get rid of the passive voice. So we're used to speaking about the movement. We have to remember that you don't have a movement without moving, without going someplace. And that's what we're doing. But sometimes we don't realize it. We can get very myopic. We can get very short-sighted. We can think, well, we're working on our issue. We're working for our constituency. And we don't...
To invite people to sit up on the stage if they'd like, they can come up on the stairway over here.
There's more room up here.
Are there still more people in the hallway now? Just push those out of the way, that's all right. Just so you can even sit there if you like. Oh, please, Barb, go ahead. Not in my chair. That's my chair. Gail, why don't you have a seat right there? All right. Okay. Good evening. I'm Jay Frankel, a senior at Springfield College and a pre-law student. I'm delighted to be part of tonight's lecture program and also delighted to have been chosen as the student who is to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Why am I delighted? A person like our guest speaker, Dr. Noam Chomsky, is one who has the intelligence, knowledge, and the ability to articulate in such a way to influence us all, for those who are open to his vision and perspective in life. He challenges the college student and the academic alike in his or her future views on man and society. Dr. Chomsky is a man who has helped shape my views, and I hope that this part of my education will make a difference in my future law school studies. The Newman community of Springfield College, the Office of Campus Ministry, Arise for Social Justice, and the New England Central American Network proudly present Noam Chomsky this evening. Professor Chomsky will be speaking.
Accomplish this task of unity and being in the same movement. And I do believe that we can do that. For many years, when I struggled to be a part of the movement for social justice, primarily within the peace movement and the anti-nuclear movement, but I never really felt like I was building an analysis that worked toward unity. And it wasn't actually until I started meeting and organizing with my own peers and started coming from my own experience as a low-income person, as a woman, and as a single mother, and working with other people like myself, that analysis started to come. And one of the first things we did was learn to ask the question, who benefits from our oppression? And once we started getting some answers to that question, then we could ask the next question. Who are our allies in the movement? Who do we have social justice and economic justice in common with? Who do we need to work with and come together with? And this really came full circle for me when I had a chance to go to Nicaragua in 1993. And I remember being very moved by the depth of the commitment and struggle of the Nicaraguan people, and I said to one of the organizers there, what can we possibly do in the U.S. to make a difference in Nicaragua? And what I was told was, you go home and you work for social and economic justice in your own country, you turn up the heat, you demand social and economic justice, and by doing that, you will help us here in Nicaragua to achieve the same. So our job is to build those connections and to do it at home. That was a really full circle feeling for me. If we're going to build a movement and really see ourselves as part of a movement, you who are here tonight need to be connected to everything that was happening when you walked in these doors. The different community groups, the organizations like Cafe Habitat, which is providing organic coffee and at the same time a livelihood for homeless people. American Friends Service Committee. If I start naming all of them, I'm bound to leave someone out, so I won't do that. But it's very important for you to go out and be connected with those groups. Otherwise, it'll be a little bit like going to a wedding for the food and forgetting to share the sense of community and commitment to community that we would ordinarily bring to that event. Now, I don't want to berate people too much, because when I look around this room, I see a tremendous number of tireless social justice activists, people from our community who've worked very hard together. All I want to say is that history is on our side, but only if we do the right thing. And the right thing is happening here as much as anywhere else that it might happen. So I thank you for coming. I'm going to turn this over to Jay Frankel. And don't forget, don't leave without signing a petition for freedom for Leonard Peltier, signing a letter to get Mumia Abu-Jamal a new trial, and making every possible connection that you can make, because we're the movement, we're where it's at right here. Thanks.
I think there's some room in this aisle over here, if they'd like to sit there. Sure.
Because they usually like the
Sure. We'd also like